I mean, there are basically two things. I'll have to give you a little science lesson here. You ready? Yep. Right, well, here we are again. So yeah, last time I think we were just starting the rear arch spats, which we've finished now. So we'll go and have a look at those in a minute, but I thought while I'm standing at the front, we might as well have a look at what's going on here. We might have touched last time or previously, I think, on the fact that we were going to use these Gen V Heritage throttle bodies. And just to explain a bit about them, it's basically a fuel injection throttle body that is a loose cosmetic replica of a Weber DCOE carb. Really just for cosmetic reasons, because I think there was a demand for people wanting to make an engine bay look, period, to an older car, but have fuel injection. So that's what we've gone for on this, because we eventually want to redesign the cam covers on this to make this look quite classic looking, and I thought it was the obvious choice. Now we knew there was going to be some inner wing sculpting to do regarding the cold air feed that we're designing for this. So we needed to get those throttle bodies here and mounted so we could kind of finalise all of that and do the relevant metalwork. So we got the throttle bodies here. Inlet manifold, we decided to design our own. So we've drawn up an inlet manifold on CAD. And for the moment, for the purposes of mock-up and for checking the design, we've 3D printed that, which we've done here. So that's got the throttle bodies in situ on their 3D printed manifold. The plan is to use a carbon fibre airbox from a company called Reverie, although we're going to paint that again to try and give it a classic look. And that'll then sit through the inner wing. The front end of it actually goes inside the backside of this inner wing here. And we'll get its cold air feed from up here, as we've sort of looked at previously. Stu's now fabricated these nice little sort of flanged pipes that sit onto the inner wing here, and then there'll be a flexible pipe from there up to the front end of this airbox. So for the moment, we sculpted the airbox using the drawings that Reverie supplied just out of a piece of insulation foam, but it gave us something we could put on there just to kind of check that the concept was going to work before we actually took the plunge and paid for the airbox. But that all looks great. We've done the metalwork now on the inner wing to give clearance for that. Really happy with how that's going to look, especially once we've done the rest of the changes to the engine there and got a nice tubular manifold over the other side. We haven't quite finished this front section of fabrication on the inner wing here because we wanted to get the engine position perfectly finalised and mounted before we did the section that goes around the intake to the airbox, because obviously the engine will move a bit, so we've got to do a hole that's big enough to allow for that engine movement, but not so big that it looks daft. So we wanted to get that position absolutely perfect before we finish that. And now we've finalised all of that, the engine can actually come out imminently. It will be doing, I guess, on Monday. It's Friday today. And then we'll be able to finish off all the bits that we haven't been able to get to. So there's welding to finish on the bulkhead down here, various bits down here, and this front end section of fabrication here. So with the engine out, we can get to all that more easily to finish that. So it's going to be nice to kind of tick that box of completing the engine bay metalwork. What we'll probably do now is, if we have a look at the back end, I can show you those arch spats that we were just starting last time. I don't think we're going to have to dig into this bit. So this is the bit that I'm been most excited about seeing come together, is this sort of enclosed arch panel, which it's been a controversial thing, and we knew from the start it would split opinion. They had a fully covered arch on the Mark 1, and we wanted to do kind of an advancement on that, if you like, and we've added that swage line in to our design, and obviously rolled the bottom round and done a cutout where the wheel sits. And it's interesting, it's trying to strike that balance between a sort of muscular and elegant, and it's quite a difficult balance to tread. It's starting to look quite Citroen DS-esque, if you like, at the back, which in my book's not a bad thing, but we want to keep it slightly more masculine, if you like, than that. And I think that sort of flair and the stance it's going to have just gives it that edge. So yeah, really happy with how this is turning out. Stu handmade these rear panels in aluminium again, same as the boot lid. They're in 3 pieces. There's basically a reinforcer which he made first, which sits sort of around the outer perimeter, and that's actually like a sort of top hat section which gives the rigidity to the panel. There's a separate layer on the panel that mounts it into here to make that thick enough to be reasonably rigid, and then there's the outer skin which is formed in aluminium, and then basically all 3 panels are bonded together with a structural panel bond adhesive, and it's really easy to remove, as the originals were. It's just 2 Zeus fasteners in the door shut there, which are hidden when the door's shut. Quarter turn with a screwdriver on those, and then the whole panel just lifts out. So changing a wheel is not a problem. You just take the panel off, and then it just slots back on again afterwards. You probably also notice that we've got a wheel under here, and this is a mock-up wheel we've been using, but we are basically using a sort of slim, sleek, flat-face steel wheel in 17-inch, which is what these are. So we've kind of got this in. It's a wheel where we've cut the centre out of the outer rim, so we can actually move it to change the offset and tack it in position, so we can create a wheel to whatever offset we want, and then when we're happy with it, measure that up and get the actual final wheels made. And you kind of seeing that poking out there does give a little hint as to the eventual look of the car. That's probably slightly lower than the final ride height, but yeah, it looks kind of cool, and I can't wait to see it all painted and actually rolling on those wheels properly. The reason the wheels fitted, as well as checking the offsets that we wanted, is because we've got the axle in now, because we've been doing the fabrication work for the axle location. So what I'll do is I'll stick this up in the air and we can have a look at the axle location and see what's been going on. Okay, so we've been doing a fair bit of work under here. The axle is actually the original Mark II Jag axle, which is a really strong design. It's a Salisbury 4HA, and they were used in quite a lot of other vehicles as well at the time, which we've used to our advantage in the lateral location of the axle, which I'll come on to in a minute. Originally, these are located by the leaf spring. There's basically a half leaf spring is the best way to describe it, which bolts into a box section at the chassis here, hangs down at the back and bolts into this section of the axle here. And that not only gives you the springing, it also provides the fore and aft location of the axle at the bottom. It then has these upper links at the top. These are still standard links on here. And then the lateral location is via a single tie bar which goes into this lug on the axle here with a bush to a mount which was on the chassis up here but is no longer there. And that's what stops the axle moving side to side. So there's quite a lot of problems with that. One, the leaf springs have flex in them side to side, so that can give you a bit of axle movement from side to side. This tie bar, again, it's on rubber bushes, and it has to be because it has to move up and down, so there's got to be allowance for a lot of twist on that. So that the rubber bushes also give you a lot of side to side movement. And also, because that tie bar is very short and it moves through an arc as the axle travels, of course the axle moves side to side during its travel. And the other thing was, with the leaf springs, the ability to adjust the ride height to where you want it is limited, because every time you do, you've got to get a new leaf spring made. So there were a number of things we wanted to combat. We wanted to locate it more substantially. So rather than having the leaf springs there, we're introducing a lower arm. Now these are just temporary mounts at the minute that we've just tacked in place while we tested the geometry of the axle and made sure we had clearance on everything and all the angles were pleasing during travel. So we're happy with that, so we're going to make some proper mounts which will mount to these chassis legs here to locate the lower arms there. The upper arms are actually staying standard, we're happy with that. We're going to have coilovers, which we've actually got a mock-up pair in here at the minute, which run into turrets, which we're going to construct above these holes we've cut in the boot floor. And then they're going to share the same bolts as the upper links, but we'll do another plate onto the axle here, so those bolts are in double shear. And then in terms of lateral location, we're going to do a Watts linkage on it. And conveniently, one of the other cars that these axles were fitted to was a Reliant Scimitar. And on the Scimitar, they did a cast alloy diff cover with a mount on it for a Watts linkage. Now, a Watts linkage is basically a pivot arm on the diff cover here, and then you have one arm going off to this side, and on the top of that pivot, another arm going to the other side. And as that linkage moves up and down, this lever arm pivots to allow for the change in length, and keeps the axle central. So the axle stays completely central through its entire travel, but really rigidly located side to side. So you lose all of that side to side motion, and because the bushes on these links will be poly bushes with not a lot of movement in them, you also won't get a lot of side to side motion sort of as the axle loads up that you would have got through a big rubber bush on this original tie bar. So yeah, we've done a fair bit of fabrication. These are the boxes for the Watts linkage mounting onto the shell. They're just tacked in place at the minute until we can get the shell onto a rotisserie and get to them properly to weld them all into place. You may have noticed before, but the boot floor has actually been changed previously on this car before we started work, so it's quite nicely fabricated. A well in the centre, and there's a recess each side for a silencer. But we wanted to just chop the boot floor slightly further back at the front here to give us clearance for those Watts links. But all the groundwork on that is done. It's all looking promising, so we just need to get these main mounts at the front here done, do the turrets, and then we'll be able to flip it over and do all of the final welding with it the way up that it's easy to weld on rather than upside down, which is never pleasant. So yeah, that's all looking good. And with a very mild chat about geometry done on the back, I've got a more in-depth one to do about the front. So we'll have a little look at the front. Right, so the front end, and this is an area where it ended up a little bit more of a challenge than we anticipated. We were aware when we were planning this build that you could get an off-the-shelf rack and pinion conversion for a Mark II Jag, and we'd seen pictures of it, reasonably detailed pictures. It's basically an XJ/XJS steering rack on some custom mounts. And that's about it really. Now we refrained from actually buying the kit because we figured the mounts would probably be substandard as these things normally are, and we know we can get the racks easy enough. But from looking at the pictures of the rack, we could see where it was situated and figured it wouldn't create any problems with sump clearance. Now we got a rack here and made up some temporary mounts so we could just trial it, and thought we'd better check everything in terms of geometry. And that's when we discovered that kind of standard conversion, if you use it with the standard steering arms and the rack in the position that it suggests, gives you some absolutely appalling steering characteristics. I mean, there are basically two things. I'll have to give you a little science lesson here, but Ackerman and bump steer are the two things that we ran into problems with. Now, Ackerman is, if you imagine the front wheels of a car when you're steering, the outer wheel is going around a larger radius than the inner wheel, so consequently the inner wheel's actually got to turn tighter than the outer wheel. So when you steer on a car, the inner wheel is always turning tighter, or it should do, so that the wheels are running around their respective radiuses rather than trying to scrub one side or the other. Now when we did our first mock-up on this, it actually had inverse Ackerman. So the outer wheel was turning tighter than the inner wheel, which would just give you continuous scrubbing of one of those tyres because it wouldn't be turning through the radius it was trying to turn through. And then the other problem was bump steer, which is when the suspension travels, due to discrepancies between the arc that the steering arm is pivoting versus the arc that the suspension is pivoting, it means that as the suspension travels, you actually end up, the wheels steer as the suspension moves. Usually either towing in or out as the suspension travels, and that gives you unpleasant characteristics. It means over bumpy roads, the car feels like it's wandering this way and that. So neither of those characteristics are very desirable, and we did a lot of subsequent trial and erroring, basically, of just mocking up pretend steering arms, moving the rack into various positions until we got to a point where we were happy, which we now are. We're happy the Ackerman's exactly where it should be. The bump steer is very minute. It's something like less than 1/4 of a degree, I think it is, through the entire travel of the suspension. So we're really happy with that now. But that then did mean the steering arms are in a massively different position now. So we've designed and 3D printed for the purposes of our trial these steering arms, which now we've proven them to work, will be machined from billet. We're happy with the steering rack position, so we'll now make some proper mounts rather than these mock-up mounts we've got in here now. But unfortunately it did mean that the rack ended up further back than we expected, so we had to cut the sump and modify that. Not massively. The pickup pipe still remains standard within here, and it's only the steel part of the sump, so we still did need the alternate main sump pan that we bought for it, but we had to cut and sculpt a little section out of this steel pan on the sump. But with those things done, we're now happy that it will drive properly, which, as far as I can make out, all of the other rack and pinion converted Mark II Jags must drive appallingly. So unless there's something I've missed in the Jaguar world. But yeah, that should all be good now. So now we've got all that in situ. We've made the engine mounts, which we were just waiting to make sure we could get the engine in the exact position we wanted, dictated by the rack. So yeah, we're now ready to strip all of this lot back out and finish off the welding in the engine bay. And then one of the other things we've been looking at is the interior design. So I'll stick this back down and we'll have a quick look at that. So in terms of the next step, we're going to be obviously pulling the mechanicals back out of it, finishing all the welding work that needed it to be on the rotisserie, and then we'll be on to the interior fabrication work. To do that, we needed to get the interior design work done. So Dean, our kind of resident designer, has been doing the interior design work, and I've got his sort of early drawings here for that. And that will essentially allow us to carry out all of the metalwork inside to make provision for all of that revised interior. So there's going to be a custom dash top. These dash fascia panels will all be custom made, and we'll do all of this in metal. The lower sections of the dash, most of the centre console, and we'll either fabricate all that or at least as a minimum have provision for mounting all of that. I've got the screen here that's already here actually from Alpine, so we'll be doing all the mounting for that. We need to make sure we've got provision in place for mounting the various switch panels, and the seats as well. We'll get the mounting done for the seats and get the seats in, so then the owner can come over and sit in it with everything mocked up and make sure he's totally happy with the driving position, make sure he can see the instruments, make sure he can reach the controls, all of that sort of thing. So that's really the next step, and that will be the final metalwork step. Really, we'll be doing all of that interior related fabrication, and then we'll be doing the final kind of finessing, lead filling, body filing to get the shape, where it should be before it goes through to gas to start prepping it for paint. So that's an exciting prospect, but seeing the sort of interior groundwork come together is pretty exciting as well. So yeah, good times ahead.
In comparison to the Murray project, I guess it's had more metal.
I don't know actually. I don't know. There's been a lot of metalwork on it. Murray's car had a lot more than we expected it to. We ended up changing so many panels. Yes, I would say yes, it has had more metalwork than the Escort, but probably not by as much as you would think.
And then how about I guess with the engineering side as well, I guess there's been
This is
more.
simpler. This is simpler, a lot simpler. Because on the Escort, we pretty much designed everything from scratch on it. Whereas this, it's a 4HA axle. Yeah, we're doing our own custom bits to locate it, but it's still a standard part. The front suspension's almost completely standard. The rack's a standard part, but we're making custom steering arms and mounts for it. The brake conversion will probably be all off-the-shelf parts that should just hopefully just bolt on. So yeah, I'd say there's probably less bespoke engineering on this. There's just been, careful thought into the selection of components to make sure they'll do the job we want without an enormous amount of change done to them.
And then the customer's been around?
Probably not really. No, the last time he came, I've talked about previously, was when it was basically a bare shell and he sat in a couple of episodes ago. He'd obviously been in regular touch, but yeah, I think there will be a visit fairly soon when we've kind of near enough finished the metalwork, particularly so he can sit in it and make sure he's happy with the driving experience, and probably get fired up about where we're at with it as well, because it's at that point now where we're now debating colours. I mean, there's been a little discussion literally last night where he's suddenly decided maybe he wants to err away from the blue we discussed originally. We've been talking about greens, so watch this space on that one. I don't know. We're keen to keep the original kind of wood and leather colours we've sort of been discussing behind the scenes, but there are various colours that will work with that. It's just striking the right balance. We want something not so dark. Darker colours don't tend to show off the line so well, so we want something lightish, but not too bright that it's an in-your-face colour and too hot roddy looking, and not too pale that it's a bit feminine and kind of. This was the terminology we were talking about last night between myself and the owner. It's going very elegant and beautiful, but he wants something a little hint more muscular and masculine about it. So I think that's the reason for the colour change, possibly just tipping it slightly more masculine. But we'll see. I mean, it's going to be a stunning car regardless, to be honest. So this is the bit I've been most excited about seeing come together. Adam!